fun. I always wanted to be able to say, thank you for that kind introduction. You're probably never going to get a kinder introduction for yourself than the one you give yourself. So I want to start by thanking the Convocation and Faculty Excellence Committees for this opportunity, and also my publisher, Kendall Hunt. There is a way in which this presentation is both a kind of an overview of the textbook that I wrote 3 years ago, and an overview of the way that I've been teaching the course for 30 years. And of course, the 30 years of teaching led to the textbook. It didn't work the other way around. And so I'm going to start with a little anecdote. Many years ago, about 20 actually, in the year 10 BC, that's before Canvas, I was wrapping up the end of the semester and assembling the paper, paper cups and other kinds of things that students had left behind after what I do in a final class period of a kind of metacognitive wrap-up of the course. What did you learn? How do you know that you learned it? That's the exam for me. And I was taking these cups and bottles and things like that and took it to the trash can, but I noticed that it was already full. I thought, well, there hadn't been that many cups and things of that nature before, and the students were not in the habit of picking up after themselves anyway, so I knew it was something else. And I took a look closer, and I realized that what was filling the trash can were all the notes and papers from the course from about, anywhere from 10 to 15 of the students who had taken the course over the last 15 weeks from me. And I was dismayed that they would view what I had done, what they had done for 15 weeks in such a cavalier way. And so I determined that, I thought, surely I did not make it clear to them how important this work was for the last 4 months, and that I needed to try to rethink the level of transparency and deliberateness with which I taught, so that students would not view what was happening in the classroom as simply some box to be checked on their degree plan. And so ultimately, I was thinking about how I can communicate this information to students, and I realized that the lesson I wanted them to come away with was this one: that the same strategies that we teach students in our comp classes to assist them to see the problematic and significant nature of the issues that we read about, that we write about, that we think about in our academic lives should be applied to the problematic and significant issues of our everyday worlds. That this is not a one and done, that this indeed has implications for the rest of our lives. And so one of the first things I point out in my text is that a composition course, freshman comp, 101 or whatever it might be, is one of the very few universals in higher ed. And there's a reason for that. There are certain kinds of things that we expect composition courses to do, whether we realize it or not. And I think, again, the degree to which those of us who teach this course and courses like it help our students recognize what they're getting from it is valuable to them. And so here are some things that I believe that composition courses do. They certainly perform a kind of acculturation process to first-year students. Even if students have had some kind of, AP or dual credit courses, being on a university campus for the first time is a different animal. And we can provide some level of that kind of acculturation. We surely provide a service to the greater goals of the university in the form of the general education core. We can help, again, this is not exclusively the domain of the composition course, but to provide research and information literacy functions. We can help students recognize that, or we can provide the direct instruction on such things as rhetorical modes. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. And forms and purposes, such as analysis and argument, which we know are the coins of the realm at university. what we're ultimately doing is helping students to perform these analytical and persuasive and argumentative functions. We can help them recognize that writing is a process and not just a product. I refer to the common approach that many students take as the Maserati approach, moving as fast as one can at the very end of the process, believing that only the drafting is writing, when in fact, as Donald Murray points out, the formula that he would suggest we consider following is about 85% of our time and energy dedicated to pre-writing, about 1% to drafting. I think he's joking about that a little bit, but not too much. And that the remainder then is set about for review and revision. And that process is what we want to help students recognize. And then finally, we want to try to help them connect writing to their professional areas and the world beyond higher ed. It's not just the 4 months in the 4 walls in the 4 years, but well beyond that. But there are some things that writing courses cannot do. They cannot meet all the rhetorical needs that may present themselves in every conceivable writing situation. So, this is a little nudge to my fellow faculty members in other areas. When my students, whom I dutifully love and teach, and who do that back for me, get to your classes, they will need to learn how to write for your field. I can't do that for them. No one can do that for them. We cannot, in any one 15-week course or 2 15-week courses, meet all the rhetorical needs that may present themselves in those situations. We cannot, therefore, teach students how to write for your discipline or for their discipline. I have currently about 40 students in 2 sections, and I think that they represent about 12 or 13 different major program areas. And for us to do that in that short period of time. So here's my one curricular wish. My time here is short, not just today, but down the road. If we could find a way to get all programs to integrate at 4th or 5th semester some sort of course that focuses on how one writes in those disciplines, what I'm calling here WID, or writing in the disciplines, that would be a spectacular move forward for our students. So, this is the overview. Any questions? No, I'm kidding. There's a lot more here. All right. So, my first encounter with Charles Montesquieu came when I was a debate coach in high school, some 30-odd years ago. And I became aware of his theories on different forms of government and what it took for a particular form of government to be successful. And very quickly, the most important ingredient for the success of a monarchic system is the loyalty of the subjects. Minus that loyalty, monarchies are imperiled. Treason is the highest crime in most monarchies. In autocratic systems, the most important ingredient is fear. One must fear the autocrat. One must fear the dictator. When that fear disappears, the autocracy is imperiled. What is the most important ingredient in a republic form of government or a democracy? For democratic republic forms of government, the requisite principle is virtue, a commitment to governing in the interest of the public good. And when we lose that, when that is absent, the democracy is imperiled. So how does that correlate with any sort of composition course? Well, the virtue does not reside only in the leadership, because the leadership comes from us. And if that virtue is absent in the populace, if that virtue of believing that leaders must lead in the spirit of the good, the public good, the common good, then we are responsible for that. We selected leaders that we knew or suspected might not have that virtue in place. That's on us. we have a responsibility to recognize that the challenging issues that we face are indeed complex, controversial, problematic, and not subject to simple solutions. The rise of populism is a direct response to this desire for simplicity in solutions. And what happens typically is that autocrats, who arise out of populist movements very often, promise simple solutions upon which they cannot deliver. And then what happens? We go to the next autocrat who is promising a different kind of simple solution. I do not promise my students in my classes that helping them learn how to write will be easy or simple or formulaic, that it is, I promise them that it's filled with hard work and that there are no shortcuts, just like the rest of the really important things we care about. Montesquieu himself says, "For it is clear that in a monarchy where he who executes the laws judges himself to be above them, there is less need of virtue than in a democratic system." Autocracies, monarchies, above the law, no problem. Where the person who executes the laws perceives themselves as subject to them and feels their weight, that's where the virtue comes in. That's what must be necessary. I've often thought that it might be useful to teach composition courses in conjunction with responsible citizenship. And I teach this course using this rhetoric text, but I also teach it alongside of an issue text that I change out every term that gives students something to write about. The book is intended to help them understand how to write. The issue text is what to write about, and that can change. What is an issue? One of the first things we have to disabuse young writing students about is that writers, that academic writers in particular, write on topics. They never write on topics. They write on the issues contained within those topics. They write on problems. Academic articles are not just reiterations of that which we already know. They are arguments about things that are unsettled, that are problematic, about which there is no consensus, that there is a complexity there that is the driving force for the study of the issue. If the idea of an issue being problematic, in other words, complex and not filled with consensus, or significant, if those things are not present, we don't write about them. Now, significance is in the eye of the beholder perhaps at times, but nonetheless, if we do not deem an issue to be of significance and have a problematic nature, as academics, we're not going to write about them. We want students to understand that too. And so the challenge becomes helping them recognize not only what makes the issue problematic and consequential, but why should they care about it, and how can they show someone else that they ought also to care about it. So what I developed in the writing of the book was a belief or I tried to extol the belief that the kinds of things that we do in composition classrooms are applicable across, and that the tensions that we want students to recognize as they're learning how to write and they're dealing with a particular issue that's significant and problematic possesses a kind of tension. But that when we leave that course, and presumably don't drop everything in the trash, that we are also aware of the tension that the citizen faces on a daily basis. We are obliged by our roles then as citizens to interact responsibly with the important issues of the real world and thereby enact the virtue, expecting the public good to be the primary driving force in a democracy, and which he argues is critical then to the health of any democracy. Seems like a laudable goal to me. One of the ways that I want students to do that, or one of the means by which I think we can do that, is to try to cultivate within them a habit of mind that includes metacognitive strategies. Exhibiting a metacognitive habit of mind, students will ask certain kinds of questions that they might not ordinarily ask. They want to ask all kinds of questions pertaining to the content of the material that they're studying. These are not content questions. These are process questions. They will want to know, how has my previous experience prepared me to make progress as a student in this course, irrespective of what that course is, irrespective of where they drop down into the course with the experience they have or do not have. What are their expectations for the course? How do you expect to meet your desires for growth unless you have some idea about what that growth might look like? I ask students at the beginning of the course to identify their experience as students and their expectations. And I studiously caution them not to worry about identifying a grade expectation. I'm not interested in that, nor can I fulfill that for them. But what are their expectations for learning in the course? If they don't know what those might be, it's going to be very difficult for them to attain them. What have I improved on in recent years and what remains uncertain, sort of taking stock of where we are as students, establishing again this metacognitive habit of mind. How will I know that I've acquired the skill and knowledge from the course that I desire, that I need? How will I know? So that exercise I was telling you about at the end of the term, the main question is really this: what have I learned and how do I know it? What have I done that can verify to me or anyone else that I have learned this material, that I've learned this skill, that I've taken this and that it's become part of me, that it's become a part of that habit of mind? And then specific to any particular writing assignment, they will ask questions like, what are the connections between the particular task they're asked to perform and broader objectives of the course? We, I think, if you're as guilty as I am of this, sort of pay lip service to the course objectives at the beginning of the term. We may never come back to them. It's sort of a, particularly with advanced students, they have a wealth of experience with the syllabus. But the syllabus asks us to very specifically identify the objectives of the course, because the things that we do should be in support of, in service to those objectives. If we want students to see what we're doing in our courses to not appear to be drudge or busy work, then we need to link them to the objectives. How will I know that I've achieved the goals of this particular task? One of the ways that I do that in my classes is we identify some descriptive, it's like a rubric, right? We're all familiar with that. Descriptive statements about what needs to happen in this piece of writing. And then even before students submit, they can do that sort of checklist. Is this happening? Have I done this? We will, after all, at one point or another, relinquish these folks on to the next course, or to the next year, or to the next phase of their lives, and we will not always be there to hold their hand through all of this. It's usually about this time of the term, maybe a little bit later, week 10 or 11, when I put on a little fake cry. It's like, we only have about 9 more class meetings together. What will you do without me? Well, they damn well better know what they're going to do without me. Finally, what can I learn about accomplishing this task successfully? By watching or talking with others in the class, or by watching or talking with my professor. These are metacognitive questions. If we establish a metacognitive habit of mind, then far from suggesting that the content is immaterial, but the content will be more accessible through this approach. So, one of the great fears that students have is the blank screen. Nothing is more frightening than the blank screen, the blank paper. And what they don't recognize is that there are ways out of that blankness. But we haven't really helped them see them, or maybe we're not aware of what they might be ourselves. Fortunately, the ancients have considered this. Aristotle, in his wisdom, developed 28 different common topics that we could use and ask questions about that can generate material, can generate ideas, can help us capture our ideas. Here's the beautiful thing about this. Students will see a set of questions, a heuristic, that they will work through with some issue once they've identified what that might be, and that's another process altogether. And know that they can only answer a small number of those questions. But all the questions that they can only partially respond to, or maybe not respond to in any useful way at all, should direct them toward the kinds of places they need to go next. Where do I start? Well, start with the things you don't know, but which you need to know. The heuristics will inform you of those sorts of things. They will let you know what you do know, where your current thinking is, and where the places are where there are gaps. That's a roadmap to success. It's not meant to be an impediment, but an invitation to that kind of success. So some common rhetorical invention strategies or methods of generating arguments include a focus or emphasis on kairos, considering the appropriate time and place for addressing an issue. And in a moment, I'll go to another slide that will identify the specific kairos questions that students could use. But there are stasis questions as well, helping us recognize where exactly is the debate taking place. Where is the crux of the disagreement? Because so frequently, even our civic debates take place in these talking past one another situations. We haven't identified the specific area that we actually need to address in order to make some progress on the issue. The common topics I mentioned earlier, some 28 places. The word topic comes from the Greek topos, meaning place. Places where arguments may arise. And then, for my own money, a little bit more contemporary approach, this dissident reading approach, one that identifies where fractures or fault lines in ideologies invite argument, and a recognition of where those places are in ideological messages is an opportunity for us to sort of get in there with a little chisel and crack that open and see where the opportunity for debate is. I love solutions as much as the next person, but academic writing is intended to help us work through the process of working toward a solution. That's the reward. That's the reward. That's the takeaway. Because there'll always be a new problem to deal with, but if we've found a way to work toward that solution by some process, then we're much better armed to take on those new problems. So specifically, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm sorry that this is a little bit small, but such questions as, are there recent events that have created a sense of exigence or imminent need? I love that word, exigence, but it's important to define it. For students, what does that mean? Well, something immediate that we have to deal with. So I used this just yesterday as an example. The Supreme Court, having heard the case involving Donald Trump's status on the ballot in Colorado, heard in an expedited manner, because if the decision for that case were to be rendered in June, as is usually the case with Supreme Court decisions, it would be 3 months after the Colorado primary. So this is an example of an exigence, an imminent need. Do we need at times, if we're writing about something that we believe to be an exigence, do we need to establish what that exigence is? And then letting our readers know, here's why this is important. We may have it in our head, but unless we share it with readers, it's not going anywhere. And you can see that there are a whole raft of these. I think within the 3 bullet points, there are somewhere around 10 or 11 distinct questions. Again, some of which students will be able to answer effectively, and others which they will not, or maybe partially, that will lead them to the next place where they have to keep looking. It's an opportunity for research. And it's time-consuming, and it's not a Maserati, maybe a Prius, I don't know. But it will get you there if you use it. There's more questions. My source here is a wonderful book by Crawley and Hawkey that's a sort of a synthesis of classical rhetorical principles for contemporary students. There are similar principles or heuristics like this for the stasis invention strategies and for the common topics and even for that dissident reading approach that I have, and I'd be happy to share with them with anyone who just sends me an email and asks. We should also help students recognize that some of what they already know about writing is applicable in all the kinds of academic writing that we are doing and that we will likely do. And that is, they are already familiar with several of these modes of discourse. And if you take a look at any prolonged text in the academic world, it will contain almost all of these forms. There will be elements of narration. I began this talk with a narration of an anecdote. There are almost always going to be some specific and maybe concentrated areas of description. If you're writing a scientific report, the description of the outcome of the experiment is necessary, using specific, precise, descriptive language, using comparison and contrast types of modes of discourse. All of these come together, and the question then for writers often is not, can I fit all of them in, but what's the most appropriate rhetorical moment, what's the most appropriate time for me to integrate a narrative, or where a description is necessary, or where what I'm trying to do here is define some abstraction by providing some level of comparison, or trying to address either past causes or predictive effects. And there are characteristics of these kinds of writing that are available to us rather readily, again, which we can check ourselves and determine, have we integrated the kinds of things that we expect narratives to do into that narrative moment? Have we integrated, have we, for example, helped readers recognize how we're making a comparison by identifying the one thing we're trying to compare and the multiple qualities it has to another thing that we're trying to compare it to and the multiple qualities it has, and help them draw those lines. That there are, if not formula, at least forms that we can follow that will offer levels of success. So much of this leads, at least initially in the academic world, to analysis writing. Even if we're making an argument, analysis is an important ingredient in that process. And what we fail sometimes to realize is that, of course, in addition to trying to make meaning through our analysis, that what we're really trying to do, or maybe the means by which we're able to do this, is through a recognition of the kinds of patterns that are available to us and seeing that they're present. Students don't know. They think that we have a decoder ring that allows us to analyze a poem or another kind of text that only we in the elite glitterati have, but that there are strategies, there are indeed tools available, and recognizing that these tools are something anyone can acquire or be reminded of, often in the form of direct or exact repetition. We see these things, and I'm surely you know, as a professor of English, interested in seeing these things in the analysis of literature, but it's also true in our lives. Direct and exact repetitions take place all the time. What is that a sign of? Importance. It doesn't always take the form of exact repetition. Sometimes it takes the form of similarity. So, for example, as I was teaching this particular issue text a couple of years ago, Ralph Young's book, Dissent, the history of an American idea, he, on various occasions throughout the book, was talking about the development of trade unions. And he talked about the development of trade unions in the 1820s and 30s when he was in that period of the book. And then later on, a couple of chapters later, when he's in the 1860s and 70s, he talked again about the development of trade unions. They were not done the same way in the 1820s and 30s as they were in the 1860s and 70s, but that pattern of similarity was useful in helping him analyze that movement on the labor front. Of course, we also know that oppositions tend to call attention to themselves as important. We don't have to talk about Jacques Derrida and deconstruction here to make that happen, but we know that if something is light juxtaposed to dark, that there is some kind of meaning suggested there. In my intro to drama class right now, we're talking about the ways that comedy relies on inversions of oppositions, the unexpected thing from the unexpected character, that a Doreen in Tartuffe can be wiser than her master, for example. Those kinds of oppositions. They are the source of meaning. When something is unique, when it deviates from the norm, when it is the exception, it too becomes part of that little marker for importance. So we can look to these things as the location for the evidence that we want to use to provide our analysis. These are strategies that we try to teach students. And here is the kicker. You want those things from your students as well. Now you know, and you can hold their feet to the fire on this, that they have been taught these things. They cannot say, I don't know what analysis is. I don't know how one does it. I didn't buy my decoder ring. Doesn't work that way. These kinds of conversations took place with some frequency 25 or 30 years ago when we had a Bush faculty development grant, and where what we wanted all faculty to know was what was happening in composition, what was happening in oral comm. We want to be able to ask our students to apply those skills from those courses later on, but we can't do so unless we know what's happening there. So this is part of my, remedy, or maybe my quest. I taught Don Quixote a couple of years ago, tilting at windmills. The real windmill is going to be that course in the 4th or 5th semester that will allow those of you in the sciences to help your students write for the sciences. But we'll see what happens. Got just a couple more here. Quickly, this is going to ruffle some feathers perhaps, and I know it surely sets my students to thinking that all the things that they've been taught in the past are wrong, when in fact that's probably not really true. Because of the emphasis that we place on the thesis in writing, students have the idea, and sometimes they're told directly, that they ought to try to find a thesis as early in the process as possible. And my argument is that you cannot answer a question that you have not articulated. The thesis is the answer to the question. If you are a world-class expert in an area, then you can postulate that a certain thing should be true and offer it as a thesis because you're well aware of the ways that you can already support it. But if you're not that person, and our students are not that person, then they need to work through the process of recognizing the relationship between that thing they say they want to write about, a topic. They don't write about topics. Academic writers write about problems, issues. So we need to recognize that any given topic is filled with issues, dozens, hundreds perhaps, that any given issue gives birth to 6, 8, 10, 20 questions that illustrate the problematic, complex nature of that issue. And then we can use the question to drive the research, work it again through that, those invention heuristics, identifying that what we know, that which we know, that which we do not, and then now have a guidepost for, and then seek the thesis, not choose it and then hell-bent for leather defend it at all costs. This is the academic challenge of the university. Not to reinforce the received thinking, but to cultivate the new thinking. So, the real power horse here is the thesis question. Recognizing this relationship from topic to issue, to question, to thesis. And if the answer to that thesis is one that everyone already agrees with, it's not a problematic issue. It should be one about which reasonable people can disagree, with evidence. This is, again, part of that creation of a habit of mind, to not say, I am dedicated to this thesis irrespective of the evidence, and I'm going to find what evidence supports it to the exclusion of anything else, but instead to actually ask a legitimate question on a problematic issue and then identify a thesis that we can defend in light of the rest of the contravening evidence. So, are we driving a Maserati or a Prius? Well, I don't have either one, but I surely don't have a Maserati, because I recognize, or I want my students to recognize, that they can work a process, take advantage of the preliminary work that they've done that will lead them to a not pain-free, but at least manageable drafting process. It should not hurt to be able to write in late March or early April of the spring term, because we've done the work in the gym before that. We have considered the topic area. We've identified possible issues and questions. We've thought about and read about and written about those issues and questions. We have focused our thinking through invention strategies. We've logged our sources. That's another thing that students think. They are absolutely impervious to ever forgetting anything. And so they have no need to write it down. You can tell I'm being facetious here, right? It's not just old people like me who forget stuff. Because I've forgotten so many things, I recognize the importance of writing it down. And they can benefit from that as well. If they're not annotating, all of this is at risk. Walter Kaufmann tells us, philosopher of contemporary philosopher, that most thought is like a light rain, that when it hits the ground, it evaporates or soaks in, never to be seen again. That what we want is to use a kind of rivulet metaphor of capturing that thinking and training it towards something so that we can dip into it again when we need to. They will not remember in April when they need to draft what they read in February unless they annotate. That's a truism. All of these kinds of research documents, all this preliminary work leads to success, or at least a greater likelihood of success, in drafting. But even drafting is not the end of the line. Revision, or better still, revision, re-seeing, is not the same thing as editing. You finished a draft, you hand it to a buddy, they correct the spelling. Oh, I revised. That's not how it works. Students have gotten the impression somewhere, maybe expedition, the expeditious nature of this, the fact that they left themselves insufficient time to actually engage in realistic revision means that if they simply correct errors they have revised, take a look at the kinds of things that come under the heading of revision and the kinds of things that come under the heading of editing. Mechanics, punctuation, spelling, sentence integrity, the format. Guess who can do that? A machine. I don't even have to be the writer of a particular text, and I can take care of those things. But only the writer can address the other things, the content, the thesis issues, the insights offered, the ways that we help our readers recognize the value of this to them, the organization of the writing. These are what Jack Rollins refers to in his book, The Writer's Way, which is now closing in on 50 years old, the big fish. How are they the big fish? Why are they the big fish? If Rod were here, I'd ask him. Big fish take longer to cook than little fish. You've got to take more time for this. They're the big fish. Fry them first. They take longer. The little fish, easy peasy. All right, I think we're about at the 40-minute mark, a little bit past. I apologize. I've allotted some time for questions if you have any. Dr. Luttrell.
I appreciate your focus on virtue. I think often rhetoric can be seen as like a amoral or even immoral activity, right? So Aristotle talks about how we can convince people by using proof or apparent proof, the suggestion being that either one will do, right? So could you speak more to the kinds of virtues that composition instills in students?
Okay. I tend to talk about that when I do in my class within this Montesquieu framework, right? That our obligation as citizens is to be informed when we participate in the democratic process. And that if we're informed, we're more likely to choose leaders, even from among ourselves, I mean, obviously from among ourselves and for ourselves, that will put the public good ahead of the private good. So maybe it would be the virtue of selflessness, or at least a kind of common civic virtue. I mean, I do not deign to imagine that my course is a philosophy course or a morals or ethics course, but it doesn't mean that we don't address ethics in a lot of different ways, and plagiarism question in AI and all those other kinds of things. So that would be the principal means by which I do that in the course.
So, selfishly, I want to ask all about your exam involving paper cups. Thanks. But
it has nothing to do with paper cups. I was just cleaning up afterwards.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that later. So I want to lock into your curricular wish. Mm-hmm. So I imagine, as an English major, I'm sympathetic to this, but I imagine that many of my colleagues will say, that sounds great as long as someone else is doing it.
To which I respond, how did your dissertation get written?
Badly.
My point is, someone approved it and its methodology and its findings as being sufficient for the discipline, right? And that means that you have some insights into the way the discipline that you're writing for works in ways that I do not, nor that we can possibly spend time in 3 days a week, 15 weeks in a semester, alerting students to. So the literature is filled, by the way, with all kinds of studies that integrate, that deal with those kinds of courses. What kinds of outcomes, what kinds of positive outcomes arise out of students' exposure to the literature in their field, not just reading that, but writing as would-be practitioners in the field at some point when they actually have something to say, so consequently 4th or 5th semester, and are not so unsophisticated as to be able to find a way to say it with the guidance of their faculty mentors. It's possible, I think, for that to happen even without a standalone course. One of the, I think, surprising paradoxes is that writing across the curriculum programs on college campuses work effectively as pedagogical devices. They work effectively despite the fact that they take more time because they help students learn more efficiently and effectively. We cannot learn all the things we might need in a particular discipline, but we can learn how to learn in that discipline.
What level of granularity are you imagining here? Would it be every major has its own course?
Well, I think we could probably look at science writing broadly and accomplish most of our goals that way. The social sciences have a different kind of approach.
Sure.
And so anyone who's in that category would also probably benefit from, or all the students in there would benefit from one course. It wouldn't have to be every major and minor having its own distinct course. Are you going to pick the ball up and run with this?
Well, that's kind of what I'm weighing.
Yeah.
Can I keep talking?
What time is it? You buying me lunch?
So, I have to go do my job, sadly. Are any of my students here? No. Hi. Some last question.
Yeah.
Last question. I imagine a devil's advocate saying something like, wait, I thought that's what composition was doing.
But it's not, and it can't. It can do all these other things. I gave you the 40-minute version of what I spent 15 weeks on. And you can only imagine, that if you're actually doing it, it takes 15 weeks just to do that. I think we also should, as professionals, assume a little ownership for the kind of product, if you will, that the writers, the students in our programs are putting out, and recognize that there are some things that they should come to us with, all the stuff I've been talking about, and some things that they reasonably cannot be expected to arrive knowing. And that our tending the crop of those folks means that we have a responsibility. I really want to thank you for your kind attention. This has been exhilarating. Everyone should have to do it. Thank you so much.